marijuana. And we are involving a clinical psychologist, a psychiatrist, and also a professor in criminal law, criminal justice, to hear their points on their debate. So we'll start with Valerie Curran from the UCL Department of Clinical, Educational, and Health Psychology.
I'm going to talk about from the viewpoint of drug science informing drug policy. So I think we're all coming from different angles. So I wanted to summarise a bit about sort of more recent science about cannabis. As you know, cannabis has been used as a medicine for many thousands of years, especially in the Far East, in China, India, and also the Middle East. It was even used by Queen Victoria for her birth pains with her children. But it was demonised really by Richard Nixon, as you probably know, in the 70s, who said many things, said drug use was public enemy number one. But he also had a very lasting effect on this field, as well as researchers as well as users of cannabis, that he put cannabis in Schedule 1, which means that cannabis has no recognised medical use, at least in the States, but it kind of went from the States out to other countries. So here it's Schedule 1 as well, saying it's got no medical use, despite many thousands of years of use in various ways. So it was demonised in the 1970s by Nixon. There was even a musical called Reefer Madness. The idea was that using cannabis would kind of make you mad. And Nixon was very keen to keep the word marijuana because he wanted it to sound Mexican and not American. And so they didn't use the word cannabis in the States like we use it here. But cannabis is one of the most interesting plants known, and I think it's a really exciting potential medicine chest because it has over 100 different unique ingredients that we call cannabinoids, many of which we think will have medical uses. So if we look at street cannabis, which is unregulated, and the criminals essentially determine the cannabinoid content, over the last 10-15 years, that's created a lot of problems for users. So the two most prominent of these 100 cannabinoids are THC, which as you know is what makes you stoned, and CBD, which is cannabidiol. And these two compounds are a bit like a yin and a yang. They have kind of opposite effects. So whereas THC, if you give it on its own, will make people anxious, CBD actually reduces your anxiety. THC has psychotic-like effects. CBD is antipsychotic. THC impairs your ability to learn and remember, whereas CBD improves your ability to learn and remember. And over the last 10 or 15 years, what's happened is that in Europe anyway, and I apologise for not knowing the situation in Mexico, other than I can find out on Google, but the THC content, and this happened in the US as well, has gone hugely up, and the CBD content has gone hugely down. So you're losing the balance of what was a natural cannabis plant. The criminals governing this by producing very high potency strains have distorted the market. This in the UK and the Netherlands and most of Northern Europe is now 80% of the market. People often refer to it as skunk. It's very high potency THC with virtually no CBD. Now, for people like me, this raises alarm bells in terms of how this change could affect mental health. Because when I was at university, you didn't see people having very negative effects of cannabis at all, even though that was in the 70s when a lot of people were smoking cannabis. In fact, it was more unusual if you didn't. So we started off looking at this about 10 years ago by looking at people's hair. Because in your hair, you can look at people's drug use. Your hair grows a centimetre every month, and it keeps a record of lots of things to do with nutrition. You can even go back to Egyptian mummies and have a look at what drugs they were using. True. So we took hair samples from a lot of young people who were using various drugs. And with all these people, we split them up according to whether their hair contained only THC, whether it contained a balance, a more old-fashioned kind of balance of CBD and THC, or if it had neither. We measured how psychotic-like they were, and this is what we found. So that, can you see this? So on a scale looking at hallucinations and delusions, which are psychotic-like symptoms, the people who had no cannabinoids in their hair were fine. In fact, they were the same as the people who had the balance. But those with THC only had much greater psychotic symptoms. So by taking the CBD out, you're producing a more damaging cannabis. And this suggested to us that CBD can protect you against the psychotic effects of THC. This study was published in 2008. Then just last year, Marta D. Forti at the Institute of Psychiatry, she asked people who did or did not have first episode of schizophrenia what kind of cannabis they smoked. Basically, by smoking high potency skunk type cannabis, you were 3 times as likely to develop schizophrenia. Hash, with the balance with the CBD, didn't increase your risk of schizophrenia at all. So this was saying hash is fine, don't smoke this other stuff. And if CBD can protect you, can it also be a treatment for schizophrenia? Well, this is one study by Markus Leatherkirch in Cologne, in Germany, and he actually compared CBD to a standard antipsychotic treatment that you'd normally get if you're schizophrenic. And he found they were equally good. CBD was just as good as the other medicine in reducing your schizophrenic symptoms. So I think you're beginning to realise that CBD can potentially be a wonderful medicine. I would also want to give you some examples from addiction. If you look in Europe, and it's the same in the States, and I don't know if it's like in Mexico, you tell me. But over the last, since about 2006, there's been a huge increase in the number of young people going into specialist treatment for addiction to cannabis. Again, this was unheard of in the older days. Nobody got addicted to cannabis. It wasn't seen as an addictive drug. But this stuff, the manipulated cannabis, clearly is for some people. And 9% of users actually become addicted. If you look at young people who use daily, the rates are really high. So this, again, so there's more people treated for cannabis than for any other drug at the moment throughout Europe. And this parallels the increase in THC that's happened in Europe. And we've been doing studies with young cannabis users and asking them if they prefer the high potency skunk type ones or the more balanced hash resin type ones. And those who prefer skunk were double as likely to be addicted to cannabis than the others. And this, even in our brains, you can look at how the different types of cannabis affect the central nervous system. So you have lots of networks in your brain, and one of them, which is anchored by these things called the anterior cingulate and the dorsal anterior insulate, is very much concerned with picking out meaningful things in your environment. So if you're hungry, your attention might go here, and your salience network to the chocolate cake. Yeah? If you're particularly kind of involved in football, I don't know, Mexico isn't playing, but you might be interested in the Euro 2016, or if you're a cannabis user, your attention might go to there. And we compared the effects of 2 types of cannabis, one the THC without CBD, and the other, we put the same dose of THC in, but we added CBD. And what happened was the brain responded very differently to the 2 types of cannabis. So here we've got the balance, THC and CBD, and that was indistinguishable from a special placebo. We buy our cannabis in Holland from medical marijuana manufacturers. But it's very pure, we know exactly what's in it. But if you had THC without the CBD, it disrupted this salience network in the brain. So THC disrupted it, CBD restored it. And your brain is almost designed to have cannabis. We have two types of cannabis receptors. CB1 is mostly in the brain, CB2 is mostly in the immune system, and a lot of people who work in the immune field are now researching CBD's effect on cancer. And we have these different types of receptors because all our brains, whether we've had cannabis or not, has a cannabis-like natural chemical called anandamide, which is the main one. And clearly the guy who discovered it in Israel used to like smoking spliffs because anandamide means, ananda is Sanskrit for bliss. So he clearly appreciated the plant he was researching. And what CBD does is it stops this natural cannabis, this anandamide, being broken down. So it keeps the levels up high. Now that's probably why it's effective in schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is associated with depleted anandamide, and it probably is too a mechanism in addiction. And most importantly, the brain's own cannabis system is really important when you start puberty and go through adolescence, yeah? Because it helps all the nerve cells kind of prune themselves down and insulate themselves from their kind of electrical current communication between different brain cells. So if this is all occurring in adolescence, if you're then going to put cannabis from outside the brain into the brain, so cannabis plant, not your natural cannabis, that's probably why in adolescence cannabis can be disruptive. I mean, a couple of years ago, 2013, Dave Nutt and a load of other people, we had representatives from all the European countries who were working on drugs. And we spent 2 days in Brussels arguing and hammering out a rational scale to see what harms occur from different drugs. We looked at harms to the users, the people who are using the drug, and harms to others because they use the drug. And if you can see, we've considered 20 different common drugs, and the most harmful came out to be alcohol, actually, both in terms of harm to the self and harm to others. Tobacco was down here, because it doesn't, it kills slowly, it does kill. Whereas cannabis is relatively benign, came out much further down. It's very hard to kill yourself with cannabis, and it's quite easy to kill yourself with tobacco and alcohol. In cannabis you do get deaths because it makes your blood pressure and pulse rate shoot up, and people with heart problems shouldn't be doing it. But relatively to other drugs, it's relatively benign. And if you look at what's happened in the States where medical cannabis has been introduced, there was a study by Hassin et al. Where they looked at 48 different US states and compared the ones where they had medical marijuana and the ones that didn't. Because one of the worries that governments always say if you are going to legalise marijuana is we don't want it getting out to young people and persuading them to start using the drug early. Actually, they found that the states that had medical marijuana and the ones that didn't have any increase in adolescent drug use. And also, interestingly, it dramatically reduced by 40 to 60%, 60% in the States, 40% in Israel, the use of opiate painkillers, because people were using cannabis instead of opiates. And opiates are much more dangerous in overdose than something like cannabis. So there are clear medical benefits from rescheduling the drug. The first step in terms of policy implications that I'm trying to push here in the UK, and your president is pushing ahead in Mexico, is to take cannabis out of Schedule 1 and allow UK medical use and UK research. And hopefully, we can follow Canada and so many states in the US and what's happening in Portugal. There are lots of different models that we'd like to really research to see what works best. In the UK, the Liberal Party, who don't have much support at all, but they're still trying to help. They've set up a working party to legalise, where they reckon they'll raise £1 billion a year in tax from a regulated cannabis market. I don't know what the numbers are in Mexico. Have you seen data? No. So the benefits of rescheduling, state control of the market, you could actually promote higher CBD strains and tell people about how much THC is there. And that could promote mental health. So there could be a real benefit that you reduce psychosis. Martin Luther estimates that you'd have 25% less schizophrenics if you got rid of skunk. You'd also reduce addiction for sure. I think it also promotes human rights. I mean, I've had people come to me who, it's only a small percentage, but some people, their pain, especially neuropathic pain, they have chronically, it doesn't respond to anything else. It doesn't respond to opiate type drugs. But few people respond to cannabis. And it's a human rights issue. If you're in pain, if your grandmother was in pain, wouldn't you like her to be able to smoke cannabis if nothing else worked? It reduces costs. The cannabis medicines that are now being promoted, they're charging a fortune for, and it's almost a monopoly by one company at the moment, GW, producing these medicines. And they cost a lot of money compared to this medical cannabis from Holland, which costs a fraction of the price. Importantly, it promotes research. I can only do my research, I have a Home Office licence to give people cannabis. I don't know if any of you have done our experiments, but they're quite popular.
Is that an invitation?
Yeah, you go onto our website, there's lots of experiments going on. So we need to expand the evidence that's do proper clinical trials with the different cannabinoids that we can extract from cannabis. So thanks to these guys who do all the work, and if you want any more information, that's our website. If you want to do studies, details on there. And this was a recent review we wrote, if you want to know more about the science of cannabis.
Great, so we'll save the questions for the end. And now we have Adam Winstock from the Global Drug Series.
Hola, buenos dias. That's about the extent of Spanish. Because I knew Val and Alex were talking here and they know lots about policy and science, I didn't bother writing slides because I thought I'd just repeat stuff. And I guess the advantage is I don't know very much about policy. And to be honest, I find the whole issue of cannabis regulation really confusing. So clearly it is insane that people in this room might get caught smoking a spliff by the police, and that could potentially ruin their choice of career as a lawyer or a doctor, or could possibly stop you going to America. Although if Donald Trump gets in, let's face it, not going to the States might be a start. It's also fairly ridiculous that you've got police who are increasingly asked to do more and more with less and less, that they would possibly want to waste any of their time trying to bust someone smoking a spliff. I do a fair amount of work with police, and I ask them, is there a policy in your local area command about arresting someone if you see them with cannabis? And this is the advice. You'd be really nice. It's yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, and you're really polite. Because what the police will say is if you're caught with a little bit of cannabis, it's much easier for us to smack your wrist, confiscate your weed, and send you on your way. But if you're rude and cheeky and you make my life rubbish, then I'm going to bother implementing the law. So I think be really nice. Neve probably could have told you about what you say. Anyway, and I guess the other bit is that in the UK at the moment, I think probably the biggest public health consequence of cannabis use isn't actually mental health. I think it's concurrent use of tobacco. Because in the UK, like many countries in Europe, around 80% of people who smoke cannabis use tobacco. That's not the case in Mexico. It's not the case. I mean, I'm not going to say much about the Americans ever doing anything well, but the Americans are the most smart cannabis smokers in the world. Only 7% of Americans use tobacco when they use cannabis. And that's a really fantastic thing. So I guess when I try and think about drug policy, I think, A, I'm really pleased I'm a doctor and not involved in drug policy, but I kind of think that policy should at least try and achieve some common goals. I guess the first is, that's really kind of, thank you, is that I'm assuming drug policy should probably try and optimise the health and well-being for the majority of the population and reduce the consequences of personal consumption of drugs on people around them. Because, I mean, alcohol does kill 9,000 people in the UK a year and it costs X number of billions. Heavy drinkers are also quite likely to make other people's lives quite difficult in terms of threats, violence, being noisy. Cannabis smokers don't often do that. You know, they're fairly kind of peaceful. They might nick an extra slice of pizza or something, but they're generally not out there causing kind of problems for people. But I think what you also want is a policy that tries to optimise kind of the public health potential benefits of the drug. And I think, as Vala said, at the moment, the policy we've got for cannabis seems to fail at so many levels. I get really confused by the policy debate because the people who are pushing policy change make it a polarised argument. Making drugs legal tomorrow will not make them safe. You know, it's a nice idea, but actually that's just not the case. So I started working with people who are cannabis dependent about 15, 20 years ago in Australia. And I worked as an addiction psychiatrist in the UK for 7 years, and I'd seen 4 people with cannabis problems. I arrived in Australia, and my inpatient unit had more people coming in for cannabis detox than anything else. I just thought, this is weird. And I was seeing young adolescents who were using and getting significant behavioural disturbances, exacerbating their behaviour, you know, precipitating mental health problems. I was seeing guys normally men, in their mid-20s, early 30s, who were being pushed into treatment by partners who said their, you know, cannabis-dependent, you know, partner who was emotionally distant, not present, not helping with the family, spending a third of their available income on cannabis. Every time that person tried to stop, that person became aggressive and violent, was fighting the kids. Would you stick my partner in hospital? That's really weird. And then I started seeing a bunch of people in their late 40s who were arriving with chronic obstructive airways disease. Now, the evidence for combusting cannabis and causing chronic obstructive airways disease is a bit mixed. I think if you just smoke cannabis on its own, actually, it's pretty okay. But, you know, everything that causes cancer in tobacco does exist in tobacco. It exists in cancer. If you combust, you know, cannabis, you do increase your risk of lung malignancies and oropharyngeal cancers. Again, you can look at different studies and there'll be stuff that says that's not true. There's a nice case-controlled study in Australia, in New Zealand, that controlled for tobacco use, family history and years of use, and people who had at least 10 joint years, so smoking 5 joints a day for at least 10 years, had about a 5-fold increased risk of cancer. So it has kind of problems. Saying that, I know the vast majority of people who smoke cannabis won't become heroin users. It'll be something they do for a period of time and they'll move on. But from the Global Drug Survey, which is a big drug survey we run every year, and data from probably from around 150,000 cannabis users that we've collected over the last 4 or 5 years, what I can tell you is a third of cannabis users around the world want to use less. People who smoke skunk want to smoke less than anyone else. What I can tell you is about 10% of cannabis users around the world are dependent. Some of them wouldn't believe that, but when we look at sort of questionnaires and assessments, they are. If you start young, that figure probably goes up to nearer 20%. What percent of cannabis smokers do you think seek emergency medical treatment each year?
1%.
That's almost as if you knew what the finding was. You're absolutely right. It was 1.2% this year. I think that's a lot. Do you not think that's a lot? Like at how many students are there in UCL? 35,000. 20,000 of them smoke weed? I don't know. But that's a lot of people. Well, that's LSE, I know that I get confused. It's a lot of people every year seeking emergency medical treatment for a drug that we think is fairly safe. So then you think, well, what do people seek treatment for? So this is weird. And when you look at what countries have got the highest rates of treatment seeking, and I can tell you, this data is coming out tomorrow on the Global Drug Survey, the countries that had the highest rate of emergency seeking were Portugal and Colombia. Portugal was one of the few countries in the world where resin dominated, balanced CBD and THC, and I looked at that and went, that's kind of really weird. Just while I'm on it, Mexico, we had Mexican partners this year. We had about 1,400 people from Mexico. Mexico topped the list for the country that had more drinkers that wanted to drink less in the next 12 months. 47% of Mexican respondents wanted to drink less alcohol. I never realised that was such a huge problem. And the other thing I need to ask, we also ask about synthetic cannabis products. And Mexico reported one of the highest rates of synthetic cannabinoid products. And that just doesn't make sense. So there could be definitely something wonky with our sample. But would there be any reason that in a country where, I'm assuming cannabis grows quite a lot, people would want to use synthetic cannabis? Anyway, I put a note saying there might be something wrong with our sample because it doesn't make sense. But the reason synthetic cannabinoid products are really important is that in some countries and some environments, they might be the single best reason to change cannabis laws. So I work in a prison. I work in a prison where, depending on the week of the month, we'll have 5 or 6 people blue lighted out of the prison who have smoked synthetic cannabinoid products. I work in a prison not far from here, and a few years ago I'd walk into prison, and outside my clinic I would smell people smoking weed. And I'd sit there going, you are taking the piss. Not only are you in prison, but you've come to see the drug and alcohol psychiatrist to help about your drug problems, and you're smoking anyway. And then all of a sudden, the smell of weed went away, and everyone started using synthetic cannabis products, which don't turn up positive urines, where there is a huge amount of money to be made, and it's caused assaults, violence, and deaths. And when I've had to speak to prison governments, and they go, well, what do you think we should do? My advice is, and this is to coin a response from an Irish patient of mine, he said, it's all about the fucking piss. If they didn't test us for cannabis in our urine, there'd be less reason we would use a much more dangerous product. The government wasn't very keen on that. He thought the Daily Mail didn't think that was a good idea, but never mind. So, if you think about what would happen if we started changing the laws, my interest is, would there be more people with developing problems? Now, I think Val's right. If you change the law, you could promote and regulate more balanced forms of cannabis. Unfortunately, what's flogged around the world is high-potency cannabis. That's where the profit's to be made. But when we asked about 60,000 cannabis users to describe what the perfect stone was, it wasn't skunk. It was something much more like Val described, which is a much more balanced stone. You know, 10% THC, 5% CBD, there is a market there for balance, but you then look at what's happening in America, where there is money to be made. And the new form of cannabis that is taking America by storm is called butane hash oil. Butane hash oil is extracted from high-potency cannabis. You put some butane through or another solvent, and you end up with a sticky little liquid that comes through at about 70 to 80% THC. It blows skunk out of the water. Now, it was driven by the medical community who said we want people to be able to smoke the smallest amount of active product and titrate their product. It was the driver for heroin from opiate use. But when you get very potent products, the potential for people getting more stoned more quickly and building up tolerance more quickly occurs. That's the data we've just found. We've just done the biggest study of butane hash oil in the world with about 8,000 people. Now, butane hash oil is rising at the same time in development of vaporizer technology. Do any of you vape? None of you vape? None of you use e-cigarettes? 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 No?
Easy.
Robin, you haven't kept up with it. So, I mean, if I was a smoker, I'd be all over e-cigarettes. I mean, they're fantastic. 16% of people who have used e-cigarettes for tobacco in the last year have used it for cannabis. In the States, 40% of cannabis users have used butane hash oil. And an awful lot, about 65% of people who use butane hash oil, do not use tobacco risk administration. So I think it's an amazing thing. BHO, super potent form, mixed with vaporizers, could help people move away from tobacco altogether. It would be great. And then I worry about young people who go, I was never going to smoke cannabis, that's going to be bad for your lungs. Have you seen that cool super vaporizing you can get? There are synthetic cannabinoid products you can put in vaporizers here. So it's all very confusing. What I think they should do is, Alex about 3 years ago wrote a paper about letting people grow their own cannabis. I think it's a blinding idea. Get young people involved in horticulture and you'd miss out middlemen. People would tend their plant. It would be fantastic. I love the idea of country fetes in the UK. You know where UK aunties show their kind of melons and cauliflowers? You could have people growing their own beautiful garden like country fetes. It would be lovely. I don't think you can arrest people, give people criminal record for personal possession of weed. I think that's just completely rotten. I think the government needs to come out and start promoting really heavily non-tobacco routes of administration. And then the bits that I'm really interested in are just finding ways of being really honest with people about the impact of cannabis on themselves and allowing them to look at their cannabis use in the context of lots of other people. So we put all the data from the Global Drug Survey into various free resources, and we've developed 2 for cannabis, in fact 3. So one is a harm reduction guide called the Highway Code. The second is a drugs meter app for cannabis. We do it for lots of other drugs, where you can compare your use of cannabis to about 60, 70,000 other cannabis users, work out how much you're using, what you use, lots of lovely pictures of joints and things. And then the thing we launched last year, which is one of the things I think that's missing in the debate, is if we're going to make drugs legal, or cannabis legal, there should be guidelines, like there are for alcohol. So last year we developed the world's first ever safer drug using limits for cannabis based on votes from 40,000 cannabis users, and we asked them what the different risk was for smoking different amounts of alcohol, smoking different amounts of cannabis at different frequencies. And it was really smart, because all harm reduction comes down to the same. It doesn't matter what drug it is, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or not. Less is more. The more drugs you use, the more harm you expose yourself to. Zero tolerance drug policies like we have in the UK mean you can't have honest dialogues with people. That's insane. Getting stoned can be really nice, it can add to people's lives. Smoking too much can ruin it. If we can start being honest with people, you know, I think maybe we'll get a far better response than the complete ideological nonsense that so many of our politicians have been critically seem to spout, until of course the day they think they might win an election, in which case I guarantee to you, they will suddenly look at the evidence and they will believe it.
Great, and